Well, the vice presidential nominees gearing up for their one and only face-off tonight at Longwood University in Virginia. And while the two will spend the night highlighting their differences to voters, the running mates are alike in a very important way. They were both born Catholics. So how will their faith play into the debate? Here to discuss, the LifeSet founder and editor-in-chief. We got Fox News contributor as well, Laura Ingraham. Good morning to you, Laura.
Hey, good to see you guys.
You know, you do look at them, both born Catholic. One is for the death penalty. The other is for abortion when necessary. How big do you think faith is going to be?
I think it's not been discussed very much in this campaign, and I think that's a real shame because the issue of religious liberty is critical to values voters. And we have a massive number of evangelical Christians and still Catholics who think religious liberty, regardless of what you think about these prudential judgments about the death penalty, that for individual groups, universities, hospitals, those who minister to the poor, they absolutely must have their religious conscience rights preserved by the courts in this country. And the Democrats have been very clear, in my mind, that they have no concern about religious liberty when it comes to the issue of abortion, contraceptive rights, and, of course, redefining marriage, gender theory, those kinds of things. So I think that is a very big issue. And on the issue of abortion, we should remember that Tim Kaine, although he calls himself a Catholic, and I understand that, that is considered an intrinsic evil by the Catholic Church. It's not like the death penalty, which is a prudential judgment the Catholic Church makes, but the issue of abortion goes right to separating the communicant from the sacred rite of Holy Communion.
I think it's a big folly for people to say these guys are such policy wonks, it's going to be boring. I don't. I think Mike Pence has done a better job going to bat for Donald Trump and his policies than Donald Trump at times. He's certainly got more experience in doing it. So yesterday, Hillary Clinton took to the stump and started mocking Donald Trump on his experience in business. Let's look.
Here's my question. What kind of genius loses $1 billion in a single year? How anybody can lose $1, let alone $1 billion in the casino industry is kind of beyond me.
And she knows so much about the casino industry. So what's your take on this?
Yeah, well, of course, Trump was right when he said she's never created a single job in her life, so she wouldn't know the first thing about business people who take risks and are operating in the changing landscape of interest rates and changing markets, which Trump was operating in. But I think about that word genius, and I think to myself, you were actually Secretary of State, Mrs. Clinton, and was it genius to move to a reset of our relations with Russia and not even be able to get the translation of the button correct? Or was it genius to think the Iran deal was actually going to lead to nuclear non-proliferation? Or was it genius to have your staff hammer your BlackBerries and, as we learned from Catherine Herridge last night at Fox, destroy computers and allow that to happen in an ongoing investigation? Was any of that genius? Show me Hillary's genius and protecting the security and the foreign policy influence of this country, and I'll listen to her on what is genius and what is not. She has no standing on business or enhancing our foreign policy stature across the globe because she hasn't done it. She hasn't done either.
And Donald Trump has not backed off in Colorado yesterday. He further defined what he was doing and how he wants to straighten it out.
And you think about it, guys. Think about how many of Hillary's big donors on Wall Street or Goldman Sachs, any of these big banks that are supporting Hillary, how many of them have paid more in federal taxes than the law required? And if she has all these names for us, give us 2 names.
Laura Ingraham, always great to talk to you. Thanks so much.
Good to see you guys.
Appreciate it.
Breaking overnight, no October surprise for Hillary Clinton yet, but WikiLeaks does promise to release more documents by the end of the year, planning to publish every week for the next 10 weeks. So what does the Clinton campaign think of all of this? Let's bring in Christina Shockey. She's the Deputy Communications Manager with the Clinton-Kaine campaign. Thank you for being on with us again, Christina. Good to see you. Here we are at another debate. You were with us for the last one. What do you think about that? Because we've been talking about Julian Assange. We thought this was going to be some big announcement. He does promise that there will be a big announcement down the road. Are you worried?
You know, what we're worried about is the hacking. It's really deeply concerning to us that the DNC was hacked, other entities have been hacked, and we understand from cybersecurity experts and national security experts is this is being perpetrated by Russia. And we think this is a really troubling development in an American election. And we've had Republicans speak out about that, too. This is really problematic that we have a foreign country, particularly Russia, trying to influence an American election. And so that's deeply troubling to us.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think anyone would agree that hacking is, you can't do that. It is illegal. It's wrong. However, some of the information that they have released has led to some consequences, especially for the DNC. You see Kelly Wasserman Schultz had to step down because of the release of those 20,000 emails.
Well, again, we're really, really troubled that this seems to be perpetrated by Russia, an attempt that happened right before the convention. It seems to be meant to influence the election, and that's a really, really troubling occurrence. That's never happened before in an American election. We think this is really a problem, and it was troubling to us that Donald Trump seemed to be encouraging that, and that's a problem. And Republicans have spoken out to say how troubling that is as well.
Let's talk about what's happening tonight.
Yes.
The debate. All right, Kellyanne Conway was on Fox last night, and she was saying that Governor Pence is going to be feisty tonight. What is Tim Kaine's response going to be? Is he going to be feisty?
Well, you know, I think this is an unprecedented vice presidential debate. We've never had this before. Usually, this is these two candidates being introduced to the nation. They're not as well known. And what people are trying to judge is whether they can be a heartbeat away from the presidency, whether they're qualified to do that job. This is really different. I don't think anyone questions the experience of these two candidates, these vice presidential candidates. The question is actually the top of the ticket with Donald Trump. And so I think that Mike Pence has a really hard job tonight, which is Trump has had a disastrous week. He's going to have to try to get in there and change the narrative. So it wouldn't surprise me if he tries to be feisty to try to draw attention away from Donald Trump. This week, having problems with not coming prepared to his debate, really becoming unhinged during the debate, and then on Fox and Friends, actually, insulting a former Miss Universe. And then it's just really having a troubling week when we found out.
Well, they've gotten personal. They both gotten personal. You know, one saying, bringing up Hillary Clinton's past and what she said about women, then the others bringing up what Donald Trump said about women back in the 80s and the 90s. What can we expect tonight? Are they going to get personal like we saw in this last debate?
Well, again, I think the bar is really high for Mike Pence. He's got to try to change this narrative. And we're going to see if he's going to stand with Donald Trump with some of the outrageous things he said about the Khan family or not paying his taxes. Or is he going to take a different route? We're going to see that tonight. But I will tell you that Hillary is really excited for people to be introduced to Tim Kaine.
How is Tim Kaine preparing?
You know, he's taken this very seriously, as Hillary did too. They both very much take this seriously. There's a chance to talk directly to the American people about what they would do.
What separates these two vice presidents? Because if you look at their resumes, they're very much alike. Both have been governors. Both have served in D.C. Both have 3 kids. Each has a son in the Marines. They were both raised in Democratic, Catholic, Irish families. What's different
They're
about
both men of faith. That's right. They have a lot that's the same in their resume. I'll tell you what Hillary was really drawn to with Tim Kaine is he's a person throughout his career in public service who's really brought people together to deliver results. You know, when he was the governor of Virginia, he had the distinction from Fortune magazine as being rated the best state to do business, and Education Week rated it the best state to raise a child. He's a person who throughout his career has really brought people together. He's respected across party lines, and he really delivers for the people he represents, and that was important to Hillary.
Thank you so much for being along with us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Wish you the best tonight. We'll all be watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You talk about the mental health problems when people come back from war and combat and they see things that maybe a lot of the folks in this room have seen many times over, and you're strong and you can handle it, but a lot of people can't handle it. And they see horror stories, they see events that you couldn't see in a movie, nobody would believe it. Now, we need mental health help and medical, and it's one of the things that I think is least addressed.
The mainstream media is hammering Donald Trump for those comments that he made at a veteran event in Northern Virginia. But while the Republican nominee has spent some time and effort to help the veterans, so shouldn't they focus on that? Well, our Fox News contributors and military veterans, Pete Hegseth and Scott Brown, join us now. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning. Morning.
What do you think about that? Mainstream media is saying that it was wrong what he said about PTSD. Would you see a problem with that?
No, not at all. In fact, it's the exact opposite. No candidate has elevated veterans issues, VA reform, like Donald Trump has in the modern era. He's seriously made it a top-tier presidential issue, talks about it all the time. Anybody who's met with him knows his heart is in the right place. He was merely pointing out that that 22 veterans a day commit suicide in this country. There's a mental health problem. We need to address it. So far from being a misstep, I think it's to his credit that he talks about it so much.
What do you think?
I know for a fact one of the reasons I endorsed Donald Trump is because I had a long conversation with him about this very specific issue, because I am deeply concerned about veterans issues. Was on the Veterans Committee, spent the last 4 years at the Pentagon, very concerned about this very important issue. He almost had tears in his eyes when he was telling me about how concerned he was, especially referencing the 22 soldiers a day that are committing suicide. This is a real, that and sexual assaults are real, obviously very serious problems. So to have the mainstream media, once again, distort things, take it out of context, and hammer it. Pete and I were talking earlier. We have never, ever seen anything like this before, the agenda by the mainstream media.
Well, if you talk to veterans and you talk to folks that are fighting for our country right now, it looks like they are voting for Trump, the majority at least. When it comes to veterans, 47% are voting for Trump versus 33% voting for Hillary. And then if you look at active duty troops, Trump gets 37.6%. But here's the kicker. Gary Johnson comes in second with active troops at 36.5%. Are you shocked
it's
by
Trump,
that?
Johnson, not at all. In fact, it's a more conservative institution. They don't want a commander-in-chief Hillary Clinton. That's the clear takeaway from this poll. Overwhelmingly, they don't want the 90s back. They don't want the Iran deal. They don't want Benghazi. They don't want Hillary Clinton.
And they look at Hillary and they say, you know what, we're not supporting it because of Benghazi, I think is the main reason. As I speak to a lot of former colleagues, former people that I've served with, they're like, there's no way. And that 33%, I think, is actually going to be high. They don't want a continuation of the Obama-Clinton era. And if you look at what Trump's going to do, he's looking to build up the military. He's providing the tools and resources for people to do their jobs and come home and get the care that they need. That's what his agenda is.
We were just showing you the graph. The Marines, they're in favor of Trump. We showed you that because both of the men that will take the podium tonight, Pence and Senator Kaine, they both have sons. Their sons are in the Marines serving our country. So God bless them. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey, a new book is exposing disturbing new details about Hillary Clinton's server investigation. Guilty as sin is the quote, and that's the title. Reveals the officials in the Obama administration decided before the investigation even started that the Democratic nominee would not face prosecution. So what else did that author uncover? Let's ask him.
That's right. Ed Klein joins us right now. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Looks like the book's already a bestseller. I read about half of it. Why did Barack Obama not want Hillary Clinton to be the nominee for the Democrats?
Because he and Bill Clinton are blood feud guys. I mean, they really dislike each other. And his feeling was if the Clintons got in the White House, the Obamas would be marginalized.
So he really was pushing Joe Biden,
he was pushing
who dropped
Joe,
out, and then he was pushing Elizabeth Warren.
And he had secret meetings with Biden and Warren trying to convince them to run against Hillary, and both of them said no.
Because Joe had the tragedy with his son.
That's right.
And he could not, obviously, we totally understand.
He really wanted to run for president, Joe did. He just didn't have it in him because of that tragedy.
And Barack Obama wanted Hillary Clinton indicted, said turn everything over to the FBI.
That was before he was stuck with her and realized he had to put his full support behind
How do
her.
you know that?
How do I know it? Because I have sources both inside the White House, inside the Obama administration, inside the Clinton administration, and I have very good sources very close to Valerie Jarrett.
Okay, so after it was realized Joe Biden wasn't going to run, Elizabeth Warren said it wasn't her time. You talk about a meeting in the White House. You got Valerie Jarrett and you got Michelle Obama, and they realized they got to tell the president they're going to have to do a 180 with the Department of Justice and the FBI. But the worry is that Comey might actually suggest charges.
What happened there was the Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, was telling the public that this was an independent FBI investigation. At the same time, she was secretly going to the White House with FBI documents and filling in Valerie Jarrett and the president about what was going on so that they could get a strategy to make sure that Hillary would not be indicted.
There's no doubt about it that people are wondering about the investigation with James Comey in charge. But how can you actually compromise somebody that took on the Bush administration that is actually a Republican? What leverage do you have? He's got a term that's going to last 8 years.
He's got a term that's going to last 8 years, but his goal in life is his reputation. This building that he's in, the FBI building, is literally falling down. I mean, it's crumbling. They're going to have to tear down that building. It's called the Hoover building, right? His goal is to have the new building called the James Comey building.
So they have this conversation. The president makes it very clear he doesn't want an indictment out of the Department of Justice. And regarding James Comey, they thought, well, he might walk, he might quit, in which case they had a plan B. What would they do? They would pardon Hillary Clinton?
That's right. Or Hillary would pardon herself if she becomes president.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, it really is unbelievable, because Comey had this reputation of being the Elliot Ness of his time, right? Untouchable. And when push came to shove, he really collapsed. And he did refuse to indict her because he was protecting, as I say, his own reputation and the reputation of the FBI.
What did you find out about her health?
How did I find out
What did you find
What did I find out about her health? A lot. I found out that she has arrhythmia, which is an uncertain heartbeat. She has a leaky valve that the doctors wanted her to replace in a valve replacement surgery, and she said, no, I'm afraid it would leak out. And people would say, then I'm not qualified to be president. She has a tendency, as we all know, to blood clot. So if she faints because of her low blood pressure and hits her head, she could get a blood clot that could be fatal.
Well, it's a new book. It's going to be another bestseller, Guilty as Sin by Ed Klein. Ed, thank you very much for joining us.
Great to be here.
Thanks, Ed.
Presidential candidates will face off in their one and only debate tonight. Joining us right now to talk about the showdown between Governor Mike Pence and Senator Tim Kaine is Eric Trump, Republican nominee Donald Trump's son and the executive vice president of the Trump Organization. Good to see you, Eric.
Great to be here, Maria.
Thank you so much for joining us. So how is Governor Pence preparing for the big night tonight?
Well, first of all, he's an amazing guy. I've got to know him. I've got to know his wife, Karen, very well. I mean, they are amazing, amazing people. But we picked him for an obvious reason. I mean, he does everything my father's been talking about, and he did it in his home state. He cut taxes every single year he was governor. Unemployment went from 8% when he got in 2013 to roughly a little under 4% now. I mean, he's done an amazing job. He's rebuilt all the infrastructures. He's had the largest school spending bill in Indiana state history. He's done tremendous amounts for vets. I mean, he is our model on a local basis, and he's just solid as a rock.
So do you want him to focus more on that, on his record, and what he knows about the economy that will move the needle on jobs, or is it more about trouncing the competition, making sure to put a spotlight on Hillary Clinton's record?
Well, you certainly want to put a spotlight on Hillary's record because it's been, quite frankly, horrible. I mean, it's been horrible, horrible, horrible. But if you look at Kaine, he's done the exact opposite. When he went into Virginia, when he became governor of Virginia, unemployment was about 3.5%. It went up to 8%. Every single year, I mean, he proposed $4 billion worth of new taxes on Virginia residents. I mean, it's been an absolute disaster. It just seems like the two of them, just all they do is spend money. I mean, spend, spend, spend. And I think we're the exact opposite. We're running kind of the frivolous campaign. It seems like they're running the let's raise taxes on everybody and let's go out and spend massive amounts of money and let's put more debt on the American people. And I think there's a stark contrast between the two candidates.
And we know that story resonates with the American people. The economy, jobs, #1 issue. I want to talk to you about that going into the next presidential debate next week, because now your father, Donald Trump, is trailing Hillary Clinton by about 5 points in the latest CNN Orc poll. What is he doing to regain the upper hand here going into this next debate?
You know, I put less, thought on some of these polls, right? I mean, the LA Times has us up by 5 points, right?
True.
So you have polls that have us up by 5 points. You have polls that have us down by a couple points. What I look at is enthusiasm. I go all across the country, and literally everywhere I go, I look at the yard signs in the lawn. I look at our volunteers, people who are making thousands and thousands of calls, knocking on thousands and thousands of doors. I mean, everywhere I go, the love that you feel is tremendous, and the enthusiasm you feel is tremendous. And people don't want a career politician. I mean, Hillary, and I say this all the time, Hillary's been a politician longer than I've been alive. And what has she accomplished? I mean, is the world a better place in any way because she's been in office? Libya's a disaster, Syria's a disaster, Iraq's a disaster. Those wars cost us $5-6 trillion. Thousands of people that have died. You look at the Clinton Foundation, which is one of the largest Ponzi schemes in the history of charitable giving. I mean, look at Benghazi and the lies and the deceit there. I mean, everything those two have done. I mean, they've made $250 million for themselves on the backs of hardworking Americans. And America deserves a lot better, and American citizens deserve a lot better.
I think you make a good point. When I travel around, the authenticity of Donald Trump has resonated, I think. And it is small businesses, the deli owner, the restaurant owner, the guy working in the gym. They feel that they're desperate for a Donald Trump economics package. And yet, when you look at larger business, the globalists, the multinationals, they don't like what your father's been saying about trade. So I think that's the rub. Small business wants Donald Trump.
Because big business at Wall Street, they're the ones that are killing it based on international trade, based on free products coming into the U.S., based on cheap labor. I mean, they're making a fortune based on that. Yet small businesses are getting killed on what? Having the highest taxes as a country of really any developed nation around the world. Obamacare, that has been a total disaster, where premiums are literally causing companies to have to lay off employees because, you know, healthcare costs have risen so much. Regulation that have handcuffed businesses to the point that they can't even conduct business. I mean, the reality is more small businesses in the United States every single year are closing than opening. And that's a scary proposition. I mean, it takes the average small business, Maria, 15 months to open in this country. Yeah. You know, our government's an impediment. You know, we pay taxes so our government can help us, not so our government can be an impediment to American people and American business. It's just not right.
You know, you mentioned the Clinton Foundation, and there's so much rich material there for your father to be talking about at that next debate. But I got to bring up the Trump Foundation, because yesterday New York Attorney General Schneiderman ordered the Trump Foundation to cease funding in the state. What do you make of these allegations from Eric Schneiderman now?
Yeah, well, I know very little about it, to tell you the truth. But what I find ironic is that the Trump Foundation has 0 employees, it has 0 overhead, it has 0 this, it has 0 that. If you look at the Clinton Foundation, right, every single one of their friends has jobs. Every one of their friends' children has jobs. If you look at half of the major networks and news outlets, you know, the people who run these networks, their children work at the Clinton Foundation or did work at the, I mean, the web of twistedness is unbelievable. I mean, it's really, really bad, and the web of corruption is really terrible. And you look at Haiti and where that money was misappropriated. You look at the Clinton Foundation taking $35 million from Saudi Arabia, who's one of the largest abusers of women and minorities in the world, and then 3 days later getting weapons deals from the State Department. I mean, the level of corruption there was unbelievable. And, I mean, the Clinton Foundation was their own piggy bank. It was Bill and Hillary's piggy bank.
That definitely resonates with the American people, but that's not what Eric Schneiderman is looking at, right? So you're facing this uphill battle of fighting against the other side, fighting against the media, who's on Hillary's side, fighting against Eric Schneiderman, the Attorney General, who's on Hillary's side. So what's the strategy? There's a very clear strategy on the Clinton camp. Let's get Donald Trump off message. Let's get him to talk about the birther issue. Let's get him to talk about his tax returns. Is your father going to stay in the sort of circle of what's most important to the American people on Sunday night?
Yeah, he will. I mean, and the message is America first. And this is really David and Goliath. I'm glad you said it, because people rarely ever say this. I mean, you are fighting Hillary, and you are fighting the liberal media. I mean, the liberal media right now, they're melting down. I mean, they don't know what to do with themselves. I mean, here we are, we're neck and neck in the polls. They've been hitting him and hitting him and hitting him and hitting him. And that means that American people's voices actually matter for the first time in a long time. And that's part of the discontent that you see, you know, when you're on the street. I mean, people no longer feel like their voices matter. And people love his message, which is right to your point, which is America first. We have to start putting America first again. We have to start putting American people first again. We have to put the military and jobs and health care and education. We have to put that first again.
Ever since he started a political campaign, he's been talking about the tax code being unfair. You know, there was a tweet earlier from Jack Brewer, who's a regular guest on the show, a great athlete, and he said, oh, wait a second, so Donald Trump wasn't supposed to write off a $1 billion loss? But they're using this whole tax story, not paying taxes, to their advantage. I think your father handled it as well as he could have handled it, but how do you tell the average guy out there who's, you know, getting just sucked up by paying all these taxes, look, a billionaire, he didn't pay taxes?
Well, you can't take legal, and I think you're right. I mean, the New York Times did this big kill piece, this big story, and they may as well be an extension of the Clinton campaign at this point. It's really, really sad. But then you look back at 2014, and they took $30 million tax deduction in the year that they were profitable.
The New York Times did not pay taxes.
And by the way, you sit there scratching your head. If there's legal tax deductions as a person, you take them. You do that for your business. Any business owner, any small business owner, any individual takes the tax deductions that they're legally allowed to take. At the same time, my father's come out and said, our tax system is ridiculous in this country. It's ridiculous. A, it's too complicated. You know, the only people that are making money are the actual tax lawyers. People can't figure out how to fill out their returns at the end of the year. Why don't we make our tax returns so we can fill them out on a postcard? How about we simplify it greatly so we don't have this craziness? But if you're legally allowed to take a tax deduction, you take a tax deduction.
Of course. And so the strategy on the other side is to just poke holes in everything your father says at all times. I mean, your father has a very clear and succinct message. Lower taxes, roll back regulations. That's going to move the needle on the economy. She doesn't have that much of a cohesive message in that regard. So she's got to attack him on other things.
Well, she's been in government for 35 years. She, you know, I'm a millennial. I'm probably at the tail end of it. She's been a government employee longer than I've been alive. I mean, it's kind of hard to believe. And what has she done? She came here into upstate New York. She promised 200,000 new jobs, right, when she was senator. She left the Senate, and guess how many jobs have been created? None. In fact, New York State was 8,000 jobs worse off. So she promised 200,000, and the net effect was negative 8,000. I mean, and now she's going around saying, I'm going to create 10 million new jobs. She's never created a job in her life. She's never signed the front of a check. She's only signed the back, right? I mean, she's been a government employee her entire life. You know, our taxes have funded her entire career, and that's very, very, very sad. You need somebody who's out of the political realm, who's never been a politician, who's been an amazing business success. You need somebody like that to go in and just unwind the system, because it's truly horrible and it's running our country into the ground.
Look, there's a big portion of people out there that want to take a risk on Donald Trump. There's no doubt about it, that they feel that they want to shake up. Give me your sense of the swing states right now. Going into that first debate, Donald Trump was winning in a lot of important swing states. What's the priority in terms of the campaign right now? Is it Pennsylvania? Is it, I mean, Ohio, we know he's winning in Ohio. Do you roll back and not, you know, go double down in Ohio and focus more on Pennsylvania, since that's an important one?
Well, listen, Florida's been amazing. I just spent I spent 4 days in Pennsylvania, all over Pennsylvania. I had Democrats coming up to me. I've been a Democrat my entire life, my entire family, steel workers, coal miners, you know, law enforcement. I mean, military, you know, just hard-working people. I've been a Democrat my entire life, and I am 100% voting for your father. I mean, I am 100%. I hear it all the time. I haven't voted ever. You know, I'm embarrassed to say I haven't voted ever, and I'm voting for your father. So
wow, that's what you're hearing from people.
All over Pennsylvania. I hear that in Ohio, and I've spent a tremendous amount of time in Ohio. I was just in North Carolina all last week. And
so all the swing states are equally important.
I feel really good. The level of enthusiasm is wild. Hey, I show up at an event, and I'll have 500-600 people show up. I mean, it's unbelievable. And I'm not the candidate. I'm a civilian in this whole crazy process.
Real quick. Joining us now is the director of the Institute for Politics and Strategy at Carnegie Mellon University and Hoover Institution, a research fellow, Kyron Skinner. Kyron, good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. So what are you expecting tonight?
I'm hoping that Governor Pence talks extensively about Secretary Clinton's time at the State Department. He hasn't mentioned yet, and neither has Donald Trump, the Asia pivot, which she announced during her time at the State Department. While she was trying to move American military and diplomatic assets to Asia, ISIS was coming online, and the Middle East began to blow up even more with the Arab Spring and then beyond. And so just the failure of our attempt to move out of the Middle East, underscored by the fact that the ceasefire between the U.S. and Russia in Syria has fallen apart. Really, I think, needs to be grappled with. Wow. This global chessboard of the U.S. trying to kind of end wars in the Middle East and focus on political economy in Asia really hasn't worked. So I hope he talks about that tonight.
What a great point to bring up this Asia pivot when we haven't spoken about that at all.
I actually want to jump in on the Asia pivot, because in the meantime we see China reclaiming islands in the South China Sea, which ultimately impacts the U.S. Navy. It impacts our ability to strategically hold assets in locations around the world. It impacts shipping. China teaming up with Russia, North Korea, and China. China has a big influence on North Korea, which just conducted another nuclear test. So even though the rise of ISIS is happening while they're trying to pivot to Asia, I think the argument would be that they're playing the long game, which is we are walking into a much more bipolar world, including Russia and China.
I agree in part that the world is becoming dominated by great powers that are adversaries, that were better friends maybe a decade ago or soon after the Cold War ended. But it's been Donald Trump who's talked about really putting the pressure militarily on China, both in the South China Sea, and then a lot of diplomatic pressure on China to deal with North Korea. And so he's been talking a lot about Asia, but not in this idea of pivoting away from the Middle East, but to say there are multiple fronts of which we've got to operate with adversaries.
How does an American relationship with China play out under a Donald Trump administration? Besides Mexico, China has really been at the center of his crosshairs in terms of our trade relationship with them, their management of the currency. How does this evolve if Donald Trump is president?
Well, I think he's going to clarify for the Chinese America's concerns about currency manipulation, about its dominance in the South China Sea, and I think he will make the Navy stronger, and he's talked about it. You know, it's the U.S. Navy that protects commerce around the world. Take the U.S. Navy out, and we don't have free commerce. That's a huge global ripple effect on economics for almost every nation in the world. And I think the Chinese will understand that we're really back and clear in terms of our interests and objectives.
But at the same time, that idea of the pivot was in terms mostly of moving naval assets towards Asia and China and focusing on those free shipping lanes around the world.
Right, but no, the pivot was also about trying to become a greater trading partner with the Asian economies, because most of them are tied to the China economy. It did have that component, but I think it had to be knitted together with a stronger grand strategy, and that's what Donald Trump is actually talking about.
At the time she was supporting the Trans-Pacific Partnership and then turned tail
so
on it.
What's your view on that partnership? Neither one of these candidates is supportive of it. Do you think
so I think this is an interesting, irony of this presidential race. We just heard Joe Biden say that Donald Trump is really unfit and has no foreign policy background. But when you think about it, really not in partisan terms, it has been Trump that has set the national conversation about some of the biggest foreign and domestic issues, including trade. And many critics say, well, he's against free trade. That's not what he's talked about. He's talked about fair trade, and he's pushed Hillary Clinton more in his direction on TPP, on NAFTA. This has been surprising. I think between Trump and Bernie Sanders, we see her shifting, but we see Trump really dominating the conversation and staying exactly where he's wanted to be. And in fact, he's found that many Americans agree with him. So he might not have the foreign policy experience, having been Secretary of State, but he's been able to sense and intuit the issues that are so important for many Americans. It's been really surprising.
Karen, you make so many great points. Thank you so much for joining us. Really interesting.
Yeah, you got to come back more often.
You got to come back more often. The Asia pivot we haven't discussed at all. This is really important. So we'll see if they raise that tonight. Great info from you, Karen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Karen Skinner there, Fox Business. Do you live in your parents' house?
No.
Do you live in your parents' base? Okay,
I do not.
This whole idea of living in, people found that to be insulting. What did you think? Did you find that to be insulting, Caroline?
Well, I don't live in my parents' basement, and I am a very optimistic proponent of the power of millennials. So my perspective on our generation is always through the lens of being responsible for solving a lot of the issues that we have here in the world and being change agents.
So you didn't care? It didn't bother you. What about you, Kristen?
I think she's actually right. I think that a lot of millennials, too, are cynical enough to look at themselves and say, yep, she was right, too. I don't think they're going to be offended by her comments, per se. And also, they liked Bernie Sanders because of his message, not necessarily like the cult of personality around Bernie Sanders, right? So as long as I think that they feel like she's willing to take up the helm, and she's, championed all kinds of progressive issues, as well as, keeping on with the free college thing. So I think that on messaging, she's on board.
Look, there's no question. Being in your 20s is hard because when you don't have the job, you don't have the money to get your own apartment. I mean, so there's nothing wrong with that. But I wonder if, as a generation, people look at that and say, well, that's really, making a statement about a broad group of people that may not necessarily be true. How do you feel about it, Christy?
I think a lot of millennials get easily offended, so I'm not surprised that a lot of people felt offended by it. And I just think that that's kind of where we are as a generation. We're going to school longer. We have crazy student loans, and that's, a lot of people, I still live with my parents, and they help me pay off my student loans and live with them. And
by the way, I lived with my parents for a long time. Before I decided to get my own apartment, because it just made sense. So there's something wrong with that, but still some people did get annoyed at the reference. So we'll see. We want to take a look back this morning and how the vice presidential debate has been a game changer or not. The first televised vice presidential debate took place in 1976 as Senators Walter Mondale and Bob Dole squared off in Houston. Let's bring in presidential historian Doug Weed to talk more about this. Doug, good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Maria.
So we want to go through some of these because I think some of them really resonate. Let's start with then Vice President George H.W. Bush and Congressman Geraldine Ferrara in 1984. Here's a snippet. Got to get your reaction.
Let me help you with the difference, Ms. Ferraro, between Iran and the embassy in Lebanon.
Let me just say, first of all, that I almost resent, Vice President Bush, your patronizing attitude that you have to teach me about foreign policy.
Doug, many thought Vice President Bush was patronizing, but why didn't this tip the scale for the Democrats in the election?
Yes, it's because we're looking at it through a 21st century lens, and I can tell you, you can see how far women have come, because at the time it was viewed that Vice President George H.W. Bush had treated her very gingerly, and he had walked this delicate tightrope between being condescending and being assertive on the issues, and he got high marks for it. He certainly doesn't now in hindsight with history.
Well, really interesting how the time has changed. Today, that wouldn't be the case. In 1988, Doug, Senator Lloyd Bentsen questioned Senator Dan Quayle's qualification to serve as vice president. Watch this.
Senator, I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy.
That was really uncalled for, Senator.
You're the one that was making the comparisons, Senator.
That was probably one of the most infamous exchanges, right, Doug? What lessons can Mike Pence and Tim Kaine take away from that?
Well, that's very complicated and hard to explain. There are two schools of thinking. One, a lot of political operatives say never use a line from your stump speech in the debate because it's going to be smashed. And Quayle had used that line to justify his age and compare himself to Kennedy. But other political operatives say, oh, no, the problem here was that Quayle froze like a deer caught in the headlights, that the lines from your stump speech are your best lines. They're pulled out of you by the audience. They got you the nomination. They're popular. It's almost subconscious how they've come. You've got to use the lines from your stump speech, but unlike Quayle, you've got to be prepared to counterpunch and defend yourself because it will be attacked. And they would have suggested Quayle coming back saying, yes, I'm young, so what? The Reagan-Bush revolution has turned the economy around. We don't want to go back to the old days of double-digit inflation with Jimmy Carter. If the Democrats don't want the young people, the Republicans will take them. But instead, he froze. And so there's a double lesson there and a debate over what's the best way to respond.
Okay, so fast forward to 1992. There was a three-way debate between incumbent Vice President Dan Quayle, Al Gore, and independent candidate Vice Admiral James Stockdale. Watch this.
Who am I? Why am I here? I know how governments, how American governments can be courageous and how they can be callow, and that's important.
So he had to put the glasses on to read something. I mean, Doug, should candidates be trying out a new phrase for the first time on such a huge stage?
No, you're absolutely right, Maria.
Weird.
Yeah, and this confirms what I just previously said about Quayle. If he had used that line and those paragraphs on the stump, starting in the kitchen, then to the auditorium, the audience would have helped correct him and helped practice him and helped him see that those lines were going to be misinterpreted. You don't do something new in the debate, and that's a lesson taken away from that very awkward moment.
You don't want to do anything new. You don't want to take anything from the stump speech. Okay, so I want to get the panel involved after this one because this is really a good one. Vice President Joe Biden and Governor Sarah Palin meet in a highly anticipated face-off in 2008. Let's listen.
Nice to meet you. Hey, can I call you Joe? Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you, Gwen. Thank you.
Can I call you Joe? So, Doug, what made something as simple as greeting your opponent so memorable there?
Well, she disarmed everyone. The media expectation was that she was going to be slaughtered. And when she didn't live up to those expectations, when she acquitted herself quite well, they were savage. I mean, when you compare the 1984 debate with Bush and Ferraro to the savagery against Sarah Palin, you can see we've come a long way, baby. Women now can fly jet fighters. They can fight in the Army. And if they're liberals, they can run for president. Yeah. But Sarah Palin acquitted herself very well. She was highly attacked. Even her child, there were media reports that she wasn't the mother of her own child. It was vicious. So we've come a long way, baby.
Yeah, the vitriol was incredible. By the way, we have one of those fighter pilots here on set today, Leah Gabrielle. We're so happy you're here.
Thank you. And they even let me fly the planes that were made for men, not the ones that were made for women.
Yeah.
This is great. That's a joke, by the way.
What did you guys think? The vice presidential debate tonight, John Hilsenrath, how important is it?
Well, I want to hear what Doug has to say about the tone of this thing. My suspicion is that the two candidates are going to use this podium to try to score points against the nominees, that it's going to be Pence against Hillary and Kaine against Trump. Is that the way you see it, or do you think they're actually going to talk about policy?
I think a little of both, but you make a very, very good point. The debate between Biden and Palin was the most watched debate in history. Some say this one isn't going to match that. In fact, the driver that picked me up this morning said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "The vice presidential debates." He said, "Oh, when are those?" Yeah. So we'll see. I'll be watching. The one thing about these vice presidential debates is they make a lot of noise, and usually there are gaffes. Some people say they'll do no harm tonight, and they'll try to get through it without a gaffe.
I just want to point out one thing on the TV ratings, that the Sarah Palin-Joe Biden debate was the only VP debate to eclipse the average Nielsen rating of the presidential debates in that year, according to the Wall Street Journal.
Wow.
Well,
so it actually topped the average.
Dynamic character, so everyone wanted to see how Sarah Palin did.
Well, I think that John McCain and Barack Obama were plenty dynamic. And so the fact that they eclipsed the average of those debates, that was pretty.
That was.
Doug, quick question though. Do you see that these vice presidential debates really move the needle though? You know, the 1988 Quayle, Benson, that quip, I think the Democrats still lost 40 of 50 states in that election.
Yeah, not only do the debates not move the needle, the selection of the vice president doesn't move the needle in my lifetime. Only John Kennedy's selection of LBJ in 1960 probably made a difference in the national election. It definitely did. But other than that, now in a close election with hanging chads, everything can matter.
Yeah, it sure can. All right, Doug, thank you so much. Great analysis from you. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Maria.